Hi, guys. I'm going to read the article that you have assigned for today, and it's about American neutrality. It goes through the economic impact of the war on America, unrestricted submarine warfare, the blockade, and the end of neutrality. So you'll complete this question sheet along with it. Let's get started. So, American neutrality. President Wilson and most of his advisors favored the Allies. Wilson considered Germany a lawless nation. In addition, Germany had posed the greatest threat to the United States' interests in Latin America. But like most American policymakers, Wilson believed that the Allies could win without the United States military involvement. Thus, the president adopted a policy of formal neutrality. He urged Americans to be impartial in thought as well as in action. He wanted the United States to shine as the light or the reason in a world gone mad with violence and hate. However, few Americans could remain calm, much less neutral. The United States was a nation of immigrants with strong emotional ties to the countries of their ancestors. The majority of Americans shared language and ancestry with the British. Traditional friendship with France also drew the United States to the cause of the Allies. So that is who we most favored. Many Americans, however, favored the Central Powers. 8 million German Americans viewed the war as a defense of German soil against Russian and French aggression. Some 4 million Irish Americans, bearing an ancient antagonism toward the British, generally sided with the Central Powers. Similarly, American Jews, harboring strong anti-Russian sentiments, tended to sympathize with the German cause. So there's a few questions answered there, and here's a map of the Central Powers and then the Allies. Supporters of both the Central Powers and the Allies used propaganda to try to influence public opinion in the United States. Because most of the major newspapers backed the Allies, supporters of the Central Powers concentrated their efforts in German, Irish, and other immigrant newspapers. They tried to persuade Americans that the Allies had caused the war and that Germany was fighting to save Europe from a so-called Slavic peril. Allied propaganda probably had a greater impact on American thought. After the invasion of neutral Belgium, the British flooded the United States with stories of German atrocities against Belgian civilians. The Germans were most easily portrayed as aggressors, for most of the fighting was on Allied soil. And here's some propaganda right here, the rape of Belgium with a German hand. German experiments with such new weapons as submarines and poison gas struck Americans as brutal and immoral. They were seen as sneaky. Furthermore, many Americans believed that the Allies were fighting to defend civilization. They viewed the Germans as militaristic and authoritarian, believing in total obedience to authority rather than individual freedom. So here we're going to talk about the economic impact. American economic ties to the Allies made strict neutrality unlikely. At first, the war jolted the United States economy. For example, cotton exports to Germany and Austria stopped completely, but a deluge of war orders from the Allies soon created a boom. Almost overnight, a new munitions industry sprang up, and within 3 years, the United States sent $1 billion worth of arms and explosives to the Allies. Under the pressure of Allied orders, American steel, copper, oil, grain, and food production increased. Trade with the Allies grew from $500 million in 1914 to $3.5 billion in 1917. At the same time, a British naval blockade disrupted trade with the Central Powers. To make the blockade effective, the British Navy mined the North Sea. The British also blockaded the United States trade with neutral Holland and Denmark and forced American ships into port for inspection. President Wilson protested these actions, but he could do little to make his protests effective. The British, in turn, tried to soften the impact of the blockade on the U.S. economy. And for example, they prevented a slump in the cotton market by purchasing the cotton that would normally have been sold to Germany. In light of such activities, the Germans considered the United States a silent partner of the Allies. Wilson maintained, however, that the United States was not actively pursuing a pro Ally policy and was not violating neutrality. And there is a blockade right there on the German ports. And this is the North Sea, in case you wondered. The submarine controversy. Although the American reaction to the British blockade was mild, the German use of a new weapon, the submarine or the U-boat, provoked outrage. In 1914 and 1915, while the German Navy was bottled up in the North Sea by the British blockade, the Germans used submarines to attack Allied ships. The submarine complicated the question of neutral rights in wartime. International law required that a ship gave warning before an attack in order to allow the crew to escape. But submarines were slow on the surface and they were vulnerable to ramming, so they couldn't risk surfacing to warn their targets. Early in 1915, the Germans warned that any ships entering a war zone around Great Britain risked an attack without warning. However, President Wilson refused to compromise American honor to interrupt trade by declaring the zone off limits to shipping. When Americans began losing their lives in submarine attacks, the American public became outraged. And on March 28, 1915, a German torpedo sank the British liner Falaba in the Irish Sea, and one American was drowned. Then, 6 weeks later, on May 7, a German submarine torpedoed the Lusitania, a sleek British passenger liner, and among the 1,200 passengers who died, 128 were Americans. Here's the headline of the day. President Wilson demanded that the Germans end submarine attacks on unarmed ships, and the Germans eventually apologized, but they continued their attacks. After the French steamer Sussex was torpedoed in March of 1916, Wilson issued another protest to the Germans. The Germans did not want to push the United States into the war on the side of the Allies, so they agreed to suspend the unannounced submarine attacks. Here's the end of neutrality, though, when we finally go to war. Wilson had long hoped to negotiate an end to the war in Europe. Twice he sent his trusted friend and advisor, Colonel Edward House, to mediate between the opposing sides, and twice House failed. In late 1916, Wilson again hoped the senselessness of the slaughter might bring European leaders to the peace table. And in December, the president worked on a diplomatic note pledging the United States to end the war and to keep peace. Before he finished his draft, the Germans announced that they were ready to negotiate an end to the war. Confident of victory, they demanded territory from Belgium, from France, and from Luxembourg, and in addition to the concessions along the Baltic Sea and Africa. Such demands were unacceptable to the Allies. So in January of 1917, Germany unleashed its submarine fleet to sink all ships, enemy or neutral. German officers anticipated victory before the U.S. could enter the war. Wilson broke off diplomatic ties with Germany in response to these actions, but he hesitated to do more. However, the loss of American lives and ships to German submarine attacks moved the U.S. closer to war. And then in early March, news of a document known as the Zimmermann Telegram ended the president's reluctance. The government made public a note from the German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German minister in Mexico, instructing the minister to urge Mexico and Japan to join the Central Powers if the U.S. entered the war. Take that out. With such a direct threat to the U.S. security, Wilson knew the country could not remain neutral much longer. Later in the same month, events in Russia removed Wilson's last doubts about entering the war. A revolution there overthrew the autocratic Tsar, and it set up a constitutional government. So now the president could more easily claim that the Allied cause was more just. We were fighting for democracy. He asked Congress for a declaration of war on Germany, which it voted on April 6. The U.S. was officially at war.